In November of 1930, the Royal Canadian Mounted Police received a report from a fur trapper named Joe LaBelle, who had stumbled upon something unimaginable along the frozen edges of Lake Anjikuni, deep in the Kivalik region of northern Canada. The Inuit village that once stood there, a small settlement of several dozen people, was gone, vanished entirely. LaBelle described finding sled dogs frozen to death, their bodies still chained, their ribs showing from hunger. The fires in the dwellings had burned out long ago, but the food stores were untouched. It was as though the people had simply stood up, mid-meal, and walked into the endless white silence. When investigators arrived weeks later, the temperature had dropped to nearly -50 degrees. They found no tracks leading away from the village, not a single footprint in the snow. The huts were still intact, and in one, a pot of stew had frozen solid on the hearth. A half-mended fishing net hung from a beam, the needle still stuck in the twine. The RCMP noted that the villagers' personal belongings remained in place. Carved tools, ornaments, children's toys made from bone and sinew, all laid out as if waiting for their owners to return. It was a ghost town, in every sense, but one that seemed to have vanished in an instant. When LaBelle had first arrived, he claimed he had called out for the villagers, expecting to see familiar faces. Instead, the only sound that answered was the wind scraping over the lake's frozen surface. He had seen a strange shimmer above the horizon that night, a faint blue glow hovering where the northern lights should have been, pulsing in rhythm like breathing. When he later told the authorities, his description was dismissed as fatigue, a mirage caused by the extreme cold. But others along the Thalon River weeks later claimed to have seen the same light, a soft, throbbing halo moving slowly across the sky, stopping directly over Anjikuni before fading into nothing. The Mounties interviewed trappers and nearby tribes who said the lake had always been considered cursed. Some elders told of an ancient presence beneath the ice, a spirit that fed on voices. In their language they called it the listener. Hunters who camped too close claimed to hear faint songs rising from the cracks in the frozen lake at night, like whispers echoing from below. Several who spent nights there alone reportedly went missing in the decades before the disappearance. Their sleds found abandoned, dogs mutilated, and no sign of human remains. A later expedition in 1931 brought scientists to the area, hoping to find geological explanations, perhaps methane eruptions, magnetism, or seismic instability that could distort navigation or cause hallucinations. But their instruments picked up something far stranger, irregular electromagnetic fluctuations just above the ice surface, lasting seconds at a time, too localized to be atmospheric interference. The readings continued through the night, though no one could see the source. Some reported hearing faint murmuring sounds through their radio headsets, indistinct voices, layered, speaking in a language none could identify. When the scientists returned the following winter, the electromagnetic readings were gone, but so was the campsite they had built. Their tents and instruments had been stripped bare, the snow underneath perfectly smooth, as if nothing had ever stood there. The only trace left behind was a single torn notebook page buried beneath the frost. Scrawled across it, barely legible, were two words written in shaking handwriting: "Still listening." In the winter of 1974, the town of Voronezh, nestled along the banks of the Voronezh River in western Russia, was gripped by an unusual silence. It began subtly. Local church bells that failed to ring one morning, a quirk blamed on frost. But within days, residents near the abandoned St. Ilya Monastery began reporting an eerie phenomenon that left authorities baffled. Each night, just past 2 in the morning, A faint harmonic hum drifted through the empty streets, resembling the sound of a distant choir. The melody had no clear source. It seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, echoing between the decaying brick walls like a breath held too long. Dogs howled when it began, and radios flickered into static the moment the sound reached its peak. When the regional police investigated, they stationed officers near the monastery ruins. On the first night of their watch, the men heard nothing unusual. On the second, the air itself seemed to vibrate. The sound rose again, soft, almost human, but layered as though hundreds of voices were singing beneath the ground. The officers searched the entire area with flashlights, finding no one. One of them, Lieutenant Boris Dyatlov, recorded the sound on a handheld tape device. The recording, later analyzed by Soviet scientists, revealed harmonic structures far beyond the range of normal human voices, frequencies shifting in mathematical patterns too complex for random noise. It was as if the sound carried some coded resonance, neither natural nor mechanical. Soon after, villagers began reporting strange behavior in their livestock. Cows refused to approach the monastery road, and birds circled above it for hours before vanishing into the tree line. At the same time, electrical equipment within a 10-kilometer radius began failing inexplicably. Engineers dispatched to the area measured an unaccountable electromagnetic pulse lasting between 7 and 12 seconds each night, coinciding precisely with the choir's reappearance. The sound was never heard during daylight. Some locals whispered that it was the voice of the dead monks who once inhabited St. Elias, executed during the revolution and buried beneath the cloisters, their hymns trapped in the earth. Others believed it was the remnants of a Soviet experiment gone wrong, an acoustic weapon designed to transmit through rock and air. A research team from Moscow State University arrived in late February to conduct formal tests. They erected antennas, audio sensors, and ground-penetrating radar across the ruins. On the third night of observation, their instruments detected an acoustic wave emanating from below the monastery foundations, roughly 50 meters deep. Thinking they had located a natural cavern, they began drilling at dawn. But after only 2 meters, the drill struck something that made a metallic ringing sound, as though hitting a hollow surface. The vibration caused the entire area to emit a low, mournful hum that persisted for over an hour. When the team stopped, the sound ceased instantly, and one of the students on site collapsed, bleeding from the ears. The drill was never recovered. When the crew returned the next day, the shaft they had bored was completely filled in, not with soil or ice, but with a fine grey powder that clung to their gloves and skin like ash. Samples taken back to Moscow were analyzed and found to contain an unknown crystalline structure, one not consistent with any mineral found in the Voronezh region. The material emitted faint heat when touched, though it was stored at sub-zero temperature. By the time the samples reached the laboratory, they had cooled completely, leaving behind only dust and the faint scent of burning oil. Reports filed after the incident were classified and archived, never released to the public. Yet every few years, in the dead of winter, locals still claim to hear that same spectral harmony rising from beneath the frozen ground, steady and mournful, as if the earth itself were remembering a song it was never meant to sing. In the summer of 1988, a maintenance worker at the Marina Bay Tower Hotel in Singapore discovered an unmarked VHS tape inside the wall cavity of room 239 during renovations. The hotel had been undergoing modernization, and most of the old rooms were being stripped bare. The tape was labeled only with the date, April 14th, 1981, and a series of indecipherable letters written in smudged black ink. Thinking little of it, The worker turned it in to his supervisor, who handed it to the building's management. Within days, rumors began to spread among the staff that the tape contained something unsettling, something no one could explain. Eventually, the recording was passed on to local authorities, where it became known as the Black Tape of Room 239. According to the initial police report, the contents of the tape were grainy, but clear enough to recognize the room. The decor matched the pre-renovation style: faded red wallpaper, brass fixtures, and an old rotary phone on the bedside table. The camera appeared to be placed on a tripod in the corner, facing the bed. The first hour of footage was uneventful, showing an empty room, the curtains drawn, and the soft hum of the air conditioner. Then, at 1:13 a.m., the lights flickered, and a faint knocking sound came from inside the bathroom. The camera adjusted slightly, though no one was visible. The knocking continued for several minutes, slow, deliberate, as if following a rhythm. Investigators noted that the door to the bathroom opened without any visible force. The light inside flickered on, illuminating what appeared to be steam drifting out, though no source of water was identified later. A dark shape moved across the mirror, brief, almost human, but distorted by the static. The sound of breathing filled the audio, heavy and close to the microphone. Then, at exactly 1:19, the television turned on by itself, displaying only static. Through the white noise, faint murmurs could be heard. The voices overlapped, male and female, repeating phrases in multiple languages, none of which could be clearly identified. One word was repeated more than any other, though the sound engineer later admitted it was unclear whether it was open or under. When authorities reviewed the case, they cross-referenced the date on the tape with the hotel's occupancy records. On that night, room 239 had been booked by a foreign businessman named Anthony Lau, a finance officer traveling from Hong Kong. Lau had been reported missing 2 days later after failing to attend a meeting. His belongings were found neatly arranged inside the room, the bed untouched and the bathroom door locked from the inside. When staff forced it open, they found the walls covered in condensation, though the water pipes were bone dry. Lau's suitcase contained nothing unusual except for a handwritten note left on the desk, consisting only of numbers and geometric shapes drawn in black ink. Experts could not decipher any meaning from them. A police forensic team re-examined the tape several times before sending it to a laboratory for analysis. During playback, the equipment reportedly malfunctioned repeatedly, overheating and shutting down despite being new. On one occasion, the power in the entire analysis wing failed at the exact timestamp of 1:19. Subsequent digital copies made from the original all contained the same anomaly, and heartbeat layered beneath the static. Technicians who handled the original claimed that when the tape was ejected, it left a faint, greasy residue on their hands and gave off a smell of sea brine, though the hotel was several kilometers from the coast. When room 239 was finally reopened, years later, guests complained of sudden migraines, nausea, and vivid dreams involving the same pattern of knocking described in the police report. The management sealed the room again in 1993, citing electrical instability. To this day, no full copy of the tape has been made public. Those who claim to have seen the uncut footage speak of a final frame, a brief flash showing the reflection of a man standing beside the bed, his eyes black, his mouth open as if mid-scream, though no sound can be heard, only the faint rhythmic knocking that continues long after the picture fades to black. In the autumn of 1823, The quiet market town of Pontefract in northern England became the setting of one of the most disturbing disappearances in British history. It began with the sound of bells tolling before dawn, though no church had ordered them rung. By midday, townspeople realized something was wrong. 4 children from the village outskirts, 3 brothers and a cousin, had failed to return from gathering firewood in the nearby copse known locally as Black Mound Woods. Their tracks led into the trees but stopped abruptly halfway down the path. The ground was soft from recent rain, yet there were no signs of struggle, no drag marks, nothing to suggest they had gone deeper. When the search party arrived, they found only a pile of twigs arranged in a near-perfect circle, each branch stripped of bark, still damp as if freshly cut. For the next 2 days, men combed the entire forest with lanterns, dogs, and shovels. The woods had long been avoided by the older residents, who told stories of strange lights that flickered between the oaks at night and voices that called out names from the darkness. During the search, several volunteers reported hearing faint laughter, distant and childlike, though none could tell where it came from. One man claimed he had seen a figure crouched by the tree line, a small silhouette with hair so pale it seemed almost luminous, but when he approached, the figure vanished, leaving behind a faint humming sound. The dogs refused to enter that section of the forest again, whining and clawing at their handlers until they were pulled away. On the 3rd night, the rector of St. Giles's Church organized a vigil at the edge of the woods, lighting candles for the missing children. As the crowd stood in silence, the air turned suddenly cold, the flames flickering violently, though there was no wind. From within the trees came a low, harmonic sound, like voices humming in unison, rising and falling in a slow rhythm. Some described it as a lullaby, others as a moan. The rector ordered everyone to remain still, but panic broke out when several candles extinguished at once. In the confusion, a woman screamed that she had seen one of the missing boys standing between the trunks, his face pale, his mouth open but motionless. When they ran toward him, only a heap of wet leaves remained, pressed into the shape of a small body. By the following week, all traces of the children had vanished. Investigators from Leeds arrived to examine the area and discovered something strange beneath the soil where the footprints had stopped. Just a few inches down lay a series of smooth stones arranged in spiral patterns, each carved with shallow, repeating symbols that no one recognized. The stones were cool to the touch despite the warmth of the day, and when exposed to firelight, faint blue lines appeared across their surface, pulsing like veins. Some of the searchers reported headaches and nausea after handling them. The stones were removed and stored in the cellar of the local magistrate's office, but within a fortnight, the entire collection disappeared without record. Decades later, a farmer clearing land near the same woods unearthed a small shoe preserved in the mud. It matched the description of one of the missing boys, though the leather appeared completely new, unstained by time. When he brought it home, his livestock began to act erratically, refusing to approach the barn where the shoe was kept. He threw it into the fire that same night, but it did not burn. It only emitted a thin wisp of smoke that smelled faintly of wet soil and decay. His wife later claimed she heard the sound of distant singing outside their window, soft and rhythmic, as if carried on the wind from deep within the trees. By the early 1900s, Black Mound Woods had been almost entirely swallowed by farmland, yet local children were still warned never to go there after dusk. reports continued to surface of voices echoing through the fields and strange circular patterns appearing in the frost each winter. In 1921, during the construction of a railway cutting through the area, workers unearthed a cluster of small skeletons buried beneath a layer of smooth, spiraled stones. No official record was made of the discovery, and the foreman ordered the site filled before the press could arrive. Residents say that sometimes on quiet nights near the old tracks, you can still hear the faint laughter of children drifting across the dark, carried by a wind that seems to come from nowhere at all. In the spring of 1961, a team of archaeologists working in the Yucatan Peninsula stumbled upon a series of ancient burial chambers beneath a collapsed cenote near the village of Tecax. The caves were sealed with limestone slabs carved with glyphs, warning of voices of the deep earth. When the team began excavation, the local elders protested, claiming the cenote was a singing grave, a place where the dead murmured beneath the ground. The scientists dismissed it as folklore until the first night's watch reported a strange, continuous humming that seemed to vibrate through the limestone walls. At first it was faint, like the distant sound of bees, but as midnight approached, the frequency deepened, resonating in the chests of everyone present. The sound had no clear direction, and when they turned off their lamps it grew louder, as if responding to silence itself. The next morning the humming was gone, and work resumed. But by the second night it returned, lower, stronger, and joined by what one assistant described as a rhythm of breathing. The lead archaeologist, Dr. Henri Vautrin, recorded the phenomenon on magnetic tape, noting that the frequency oscillated at nearly perfect intervals, as though patterned by design. When he played the recording back at dawn, the sound was barely audible to human ears, yet the camp dogs reacted violently, howling and clawing at the dirt. One collapsed minutes later, bleeding from its nose. Still, the team pressed forward, breaking through into the burial vault that had remained untouched for centuries. Inside, they found 12 stone sarcophagi arranged in a circle, each lid carved with the same symbol, a spiral encased in a ring of smaller dots, identical to the ones on the cenote's warning stones. As they began cataloguing the site, strange malfunctions plagued the camp. Compasses spun erratically, lanterns flickered despite fresh fuel, and camera film came out overexposed, showing faint white silhouettes surrounding the workers. The humming persisted now, even during the day, a constant vibration that seemed to come from below their feet. When Vautrin returned to his tent one evening, he found his recording equipment still running, though he had not switched it on. The tape inside had captured something new, a voice, faint and trembling, speaking in a language no one could recognize. Linguists later confirmed that the structure of the words resembled no known Mayan dialect or regional tongue. The only phrase remotely translatable was one that repeated at regular intervals, roughly corresponding to the words, "We remain." By the fourth week, several workers quit, refusing to stay another night. Those who remained reported strange dreams filled with echoing tunnels and walls that seemed to breathe. Vautrin himself began to deteriorate, complaining of a constant pressure in his skull. His final journal entry, written 2 days before the project was abandoned, described hearing the hum even when underwater and feeling it pulse through his bones. On the morning the team withdrew, a small tremor shook the area, collapsing part of the main cavern. 2 assistants trapped near the entrance swore they heard singing echoing from beneath the rubble, distant but unmistakably human. When the Mexican Geological Survey later visited the site, they found the cenote filled with warm, churning water, emitting low-frequency vibrations detectable even at the surface. Instruments placed near the opening malfunctioned after several minutes. The readings showing bursts of infrasound below 20 Hz, frequencies capable of inducing anxiety, nausea, and visual distortion in humans. The recordings collected that day were sealed for study, but technicians who analyzed them reported hearing faint tones buried beneath the low rumble. Tones that formed repeating melodic structures impossible for random geological activity. 2 months later, the cenote flooded entirely, sealing the burial chambers beneath 60 meters of dark, humming water. Locals claim that when the air is still and the night is windless, the earth itself sings from beneath the limestone, long, mournful notes that echo through the jungle, vibrating in the bones of anyone who dares to listen too long. On the night of July the 2nd, 1999, a Japan Airlines passenger flight, Flight 327, departed from Los Angeles, bound for Tokyo. The trip was routine, uneventful, until the aircraft reached the midpoint of the Pacific. At 3:42 a.m. UTC, the plane's communication log registered a brief blackout lasting 11 minutes. During that window, all contact with air traffic control was lost, and the radar signature of the aircraft vanished completely. When the signal reappeared, the plane was precisely on its intended course, but every onboard clock was delayed by 8 minutes. The captain reported no technical malfunctions, though several passengers later told investigators that during the silence, the cabin lights dimmed and a faint blue glow filled the aisle windows. No one could tell whether it was lightning or something else. When Flight 327 landed safely at Narita Airport, the anomaly was written off as a navigational error caused by solar interference. The passengers were allowed to disembark as usual. But 2 days later, the airline's maintenance division discovered an undeclared disposable camera wedged beneath seat 14A. The film inside had been partially developed, containing 21 photos, most depicting standard cabin scenes, passengers asleep or reading. But the final 3 frames drew immediate concern. They appeared completely dark at first glance, but under enhanced light. Faint images emerged, the outline of the aircraft interior distorted as though submerged in water, and several faces pressed against the windows from outside. Their features blurred, eyes hollow, mouths open as if mid-scream. The cabin manifest confirmed that no one sitting near that row had taken photographs during the flight. The camera was traced to a missing Japanese student named Aiko Morita, who had been aboard Flight 327. She was last seen exiting the plane and speaking briefly with customs officers before disappearing in the terminal. Security footage captured her walking toward the exit, clutching what appeared to be a developed film envelope. She never reached the taxi stand, and no further footage showed her leaving the airport. Her luggage remained unclaimed, containing clothing, books, and a torn page from a travel journal describing a soft, pulsing light outside the cabin window, and the sensation that time had stopped breathing. The page ended mid-sentence. The ink dragged across the paper as though the pen had been pulled from her hand. When the photographs were sent for professional examination, analysts discovered something extraordinary. Embedded within the grain of the final frame was a series of recurring micro-patterns, regular geometric forms, invisible to the naked eye, but visible under magnification. These patterns, when converted to binary data, produced an audio waveform. The sound generated from the conversion was described as a deep rhythmic thrum, similar to a heartbeat, punctuated by faint metallic clicks. Scientists speculated it might have been caused by interference during the camera's exposure to cosmic radiation, but the sequence of repetition did not match any known radiation artifact. The audio looped in a precise 21-second interval, mirroring the time between the final recorded transmissions. Of Flight 327 during the blackout period, Japanese and U.S. aviation authorities conducted a joint review of the incident, but classified the details under internal safety protocol. Years later, a retired technician admitted that copies of the enhanced photographs were stored in a restricted archive. He described one detail not included in the official report. In the reflection of the cabin window, just behind the photographer, was the faint outline of a figure standing in the aisle. The person's head appeared elongated, the eyes completely black, and the hands resting on the seat in front as though steadying themselves. The rest of the body dissolved into a haze of static light. For months after the event, passengers from that same flight reported strange disturbances, digital clocks stopping for exactly 8 minutes at random times, watches running backward, and persistent dreams of being suspended in a pale blue light. One passenger, a doctor from Kyoto, claimed he would wake each night at 3:42 a.m. to the sound of rushing wind and a faint whisper repeating the word, "Return." The airline quietly changed the flight number the following year. Despite official denials, staff who serviced the aircraft later said that when they replaced the seats in the cabin, several of the metal frames were magnetized in irregular, pulsing intervals, as though charged by something unseen. The camera, the negatives, and the remaining evidence were placed into long-term storage, and later went missing from the Narita Records room during a renovation in 2006. No copies have surfaced publicly since, but a few aviation engineers still whisper of the lost photographs, 21 stills that capture something seen above the Pacific, where the light never quite fades and time, for 8 minutes, forgot how to move forward. In the winter of 1957, a small East German village near Lübbenau reported strange lights appearing over Lake Langensee, a long stretch of dark glacial water surrounded by dense pine forest. The first accounts came from fishermen who described shimmering beams beneath the ice, moving as if alive, tracing slow, deliberate paths from one end of the lake to the other. The lights were not the reflected glow of lanterns or moonlight. They pulsed from below, deep under the frozen surface. Within days, the phenomenon spread. Villagers claimed to see luminous shapes drifting upward through the ice, sometimes forming perfect circles before fading into darkness. As news reached the regional authorities, scientists from Dresden University were dispatched to investigate, assuming natural gas pockets or phosphorescent algae were to blame. When they arrived, they found the lake sealed by thick ice, smooth as glass, and beneath it faint streaks of blue-green light twisting like veins. The team drilled a narrow hole through the ice and lowered a thermal probe. At a depth of 12 meters, the water temperature began rising instead of dropping. The readings were inconsistent, fluctuating by several degrees within seconds. When they retracted the probe, the wire emitted a faint vibration, and the metal tip was warm to the touch, despite the sub-zero air. They recorded this anomaly in their notes, but dismissed it as mechanical error. That night, they set up cameras to document the light activity. The first several hours passed uneventfully until just after 2 a.m., when the ice began to crack, not with the usual thunder of expansion, but in a slow, deliberate rhythm, as if something below were pressing upward. The cracks radiated outward in near-perfect symmetry, forming a 6-pointed pattern visible from the shore. Then the lights flared, blindingly bright, before sinking back into the depths. The ice refroze almost instantly, erasing the fractures as if they had never existed. Villagers reported that their radios had gone dead at that same moment. Several claimed to hear a low droning sound, not from the air, but from the ground beneath their feet. It lasted nearly 2 minutes and stopped the instant the lights disappeared. When the scientists reviewed their footage, the film showed faint flickers of illumination, then sudden blackness, followed by several frames of distortion that looked like blurred faces pressed against glass. The film stock melted during processing despite normal temperature controls. The Institute ordered another expedition, this time accompanied by military personnel, who fenced off the lake and restricted access. Over the following week, the soldiers stationed there reported insomnia, nausea, and nosebleeds. One man allegedly wandered onto the ice during patrol, drawn toward the faint light beneath. His body was never recovered, though his footprints led straight to the center of the lake, ending abruptly at a patch of ice thinner than paper. Months later, when spring came and the thaw began, fragments of metallic debris surfaced near the southern edge of Langense. The pieces were smooth, curved, and lightweight, unlike any known alloy at the time. Laboratory tests showed no corrosion, no identifiable manufacturing marks, and an internal crystalline structure that refracted light unnaturally, creating faint, luminous halos around the samples. The government confiscated the fragments, and all public records of the discovery were sealed. The official explanation cited environmental contamination, though none of the scientists involved were ever reassigned to other projects. In the years following, residents near the lake noticed peculiar phenomena. Electrical devices malfunctioned during thunderstorms, and compasses spun erratically within a few hundred meters of the shoreline. Divers who attempted to explore the lake in later decades reported an oppressive silence below the surface, as though sound itself was absorbed. Some emerged disoriented, describing flickers of movement in the darkness, columns of light shaped like human forms drifting just beyond visibility. One diver years later confessed in an interview that while submerged, he had heard a faint knocking against his helmet, rhythmic and deliberate, like someone tapping from the other side. The sound followed him upward until he broke the surface, where the lake was calm, perfectly still, and the water around him faintly glowed for several seconds before vanishing into the black. Locals now refer to it as the breathing lake, claiming that on certain winter nights when the temperature drops below freezing, the surface rises and falls slightly, as though the water itself inhales. No one fishes there anymore. When the mist rolls across the trees and settles low on the ice, faint blue light can still be seen swirling beneath, tracing the old six-pointed pattern that appeared that first winter, glowing softly before fading, as if something down there still remembers the shape it once tried to take. In the summer of 1783, the eruption of Mount Asama in central Japan devastated the surrounding region, burying villages in ash and claiming thousands of lives. Among the chaos, a group of Buddhist monks from a nearby monastery, known as Enryakuji, attempted to record the eruption sounds using primitive wooden cylinders coated in soot, a method developed to study the resonance of earthquakes. Their recordings, carved with the vibrations of the air itself, were forgotten for more than a century until 1892, when a historian rediscovered the cylinders sealed in a lacquer box beneath the temple floor. The inscriptions were remarkably well preserved, marked with deep, symmetrical grooves. When researchers in Tokyo attempted to reconstruct the audio by tracing the patterns with modern instruments, they expected the dull roar of volcanic thunder. What emerged instead was something far stranger, a deep, human-like wail rising and falling in steady intervals, layered with faint whispers that seemed to form words. At first, the scholars believed the distortion came from the primitive method of capture. But as they refined the playback, the details sharpened. Beneath the roar of the eruption, they identified rhythmic tonal patterns not found in any natural sound. It resembled chanting, slow, deliberate, almost liturgical. The tone shifted unpredictably, alternating between grief and fury, at times overlapping into a dissonant chorus. Some researchers claim to hear fragments of intelligible Japanese, though no one could agree on the exact phrasing. The most common interpretation was that the voice repeated a phrase meaning, "Do not unseal." When the news reached the temple, several monks urged the scientists to destroy the cylinders, insisting that the voices belonged to those who had perished in the eruption, and that replaying them would disturb their rest. The scholars ignored the warnings, and over the next few months, strange incidents began to plague their laboratory. Equipment malfunctioned at random, and wax phonograph recordings used for replication developed cracks that seemed to spread from within. A student who worked on transcribing the grooves claimed to hear the sound long after leaving the lab, a faint moan that followed him through the streets of Tokyo, audible only when he passed near sources of running water. 2 weeks later, he was found drowned in the Sumida River, his pockets filled with black volcanic ash. The following day, the lead researcher reported that one of the cylinders had vanished. When they checked the storage case, the remaining cylinders had warped, their surfaces blistered as though exposed to extreme heat. Yet the box itself was untouched. Decades later, during the 1930s, the Ministry of Education sponsored another attempt to analyze the surviving samples. A linguist named Professor Takamura claimed to identify patterns consistent with phonetic intonation, implying that the sounds were not random but carried structured information, possibly speech. He noted that the harmonics resembled multiple voices speaking at once, their tones aligned too precisely to be accidental. When he slowed the playback to 1/3 speed, a single distinct voice emerged from the layers. It was low, almost guttural, and seemed to breathe between syllables. Several listeners fainted during the session, describing the sensation of being pulled into the sound. The recording was immediately sealed, and Professor Takamura withdrew from public work, later writing only that he believed something alive had been recorded, something that still listens. In 1956, the cylinders were relocated to a new archive in Nagano Prefecture. That winter, a fire destroyed the storage wing, consuming everything inside except a single cylinder found intact amid the ashes. The grooves on its surface were still sharp, though they now emitted a faint smell of sulfur. When a technician handling the relic attempted to make a rubbing of the inscriptions, the paper scorched at his touch. No one tried to play it again. Still, witnesses claim that during particularly violent tremors in the region, the air near Mount Asama carries a strange sound, half wind, half voice, rising from the direction of the old temple. It begins as a low hum and then swells into what some describe as chanting, others as screams, echoing through the valleys for minutes after the shaking stops. The monks say it is the mountain remembering the breath of those who burned inside it, the trapped voices of the eruption still caught in stone, whispering their warnings to anyone who dares to listen. In the autumn of 1954, the St. Agnes Psychiatric Hospital in Maryland began closing its older wards in preparation for modernization. The institution had operated since the early 1900s and held a reputation for pioneering, but often controversial, treatments in experimental neurology. During the process of clearing the eastern wing, workers discovered a sealed storage room behind a false wall. Inside were rows of filing cabinets coated in dust and several metal-bound journals marked Ward C. The entries dated from 1949 to 1953. authored by the hospital's chief psychiatrist, Dr. Arthur Bellamy, who had vanished without explanation just months before the wing was closed. The journals detailed a series of patient experiments conducted in isolation, sessions involving what he called sensory inversion therapy, an attempt to study the effects of total sensory deprivation combined with low-frequency sound stimulation. The accounts grew more erratic with each page. Early entries describe patients reporting mild hallucinations, shapes moving in darkness, phantom sounds, a feeling of being watched. Later, the subjects began exhibiting identical dreams, all describing a corridor that led endlessly downward. They spoke of distant murmurs echoing from below, a mechanical humming like a heartbeat. Bellamy noted the coincidence, but continued his work, increasing the duration of deprivation sessions. Over time, the hallucinations took on consistent form. Every subject began reporting the presence of a woman, standing at the far end of the corridor, her face obscured, whispering in a language none could understand. When he played back the session recordings, the tapes were saturated with static, but beneath it, faint rhythmic tapping could be heard, matching the pulse of the sound generators in the isolation chambers. The final journal entries read less like medical documentation and more like confession. Bellamy wrote that during one experiment, all 7 active chambers began vibrating simultaneously, though only one machine was running. The sound filled the entire ward, shaking glass and fixtures, yet no readings appeared on the power meters. When orderlies opened the chambers, 3 patients were unresponsive, their bodies rigid, eyes open, pupils fully dilated. Their EEGs registered faint electrical activity, steady rhythmic pulses synchronized across all 3, as if sharing a single signal. Bellamy claimed that when he tried to disconnect the equipment, he heard a voice through the static calling his name. The patient's lips moved in unison, though their lungs had stopped functioning minutes before. The entry ends mid-sentence, the pen dragging across the page. When investigators reviewed the sealed room, they found remnants of the sound generators, custom-built devices resembling large tuning forks powered by magnetic coils. Tests revealed that the machines produced subsonic frequencies below the threshold of human hearing, capable of resonating with cranial cavities and inducing visual distortions. Yet even with modern replication, the recorded tones failed to reproduce the effects described in the notes. Engineers who worked on the reactivation reported headaches, disorientation, and brief lapses in memory. One technician claimed to hear whispering inside the walls of the lab, synchronized with the oscillation of the generator. He quit the following day and refused to return to the site. Years later, the abandoned wing of St. Agnes was demolished. But locals say the construction crews refused to touch the lower level where the deprivation chambers had once been. They sealed it with concrete instead, leaving the sub-basement intact. Residents in nearby neighborhoods began reporting strange vibrations at night, faint humming that made windows rattle for minutes before fading away. In 1972, a journalist who accessed the hospital archives uncovered one of the remaining session tapes mislabeled in storage. When he played it, he described hearing a faint voice repeating the phrase, "Not gone, just beneath." The tape recorder reportedly jammed, looping the words over and over until the machine overheated. That journalist later published a single article before withdrawing from the project entirely, claiming that he had begun hearing the same sound in his own home, soft, rhythmic tapping from the walls at precisely 3:15 every morning. No one else in the house ever heard it, and within months he vanished without leaving a trace. The room where he wrote his last article was found undisturbed. The only sound remaining on his dictaphone, a single, low hum that persisted even after the tape ended. In February of 2015, the small farming settlement of Kalivayal in southern India was marked for routine census work. When surveyors arrived, they found the village completely deserted. There were no signs of violence, no tracks leading away, and every home appeared abandoned mid-task. Cooking pots half filled with rice, clothes drying on lines, tools scattered in the fields. Livestock wandered freely through the empty streets. The population, totaling 112 people, had simply vanished. Police initially assumed mass migration or forced evacuation due to flooding, but the monsoon season had not yet begun, and there were no reports of displacement anywhere nearby. The region was remote, surrounded by dense jungle, accessible only by a single road that ended at the village's edge. The investigation began within days, but what they discovered only deepened the mystery. Search teams fanned out into the forest surrounding Kalivayal, marking a 5-kilometer radius. After 2 days, they began finding strange arrangements of stones and wooden idols placed along the forest floor, as if forming paths toward the hills. The carvings were crude but unsettling, figures with hollow eyes, mouths open in what looked like song. Some stones bore symbols resembling early Dravidian script, though the villagers were not known to practice ancient rites. Beneath one of these formations, officers uncovered a freshly dug pit containing animal bones arranged in a spiral, the tips of the vertebrae stained black as if burned from within. Forensic testing later confirmed no chemical residue or combustion marks consistent with fire. That same night, several searchers reported hearing voices echoing through the jungle, low, rhythmic chanting that seemed to move in a circle around them, fading whenever they tried to follow. The following morning, officers discovered a cluster of mobile phones and personal effects near a shallow stream 2 kilometers from the village. Every device was powered off, yet one contained a final video clip recorded on the evening before the disappearance. The footage showed a group of villagers gathered around a fire, singing softly in a language no one recognized. The recording ended abruptly when the camera tilted upward toward the tree canopy, capturing a faint red light moving slowly above the clearing. Audio analysts later noted a low-frequency vibration beneath the sound of the fire crackle, consistent with mechanical resonance, but pulsing irregularly, almost like breathing. When authorities tried to trace the GPS metadata from the video, it led not to the forest, but to a blank coordinate in the middle of the Western Ghats, nearly 70 kilometers away. By the end of the week, the government sealed off the area, citing biohazard concerns due to potential contamination. Researchers who entered under controlled conditions reported electromagnetic interference affecting their instruments, as well as brief visual distortions, rippling heat mirages forming in cool air. Local folklore resurfaced describing the second dawn, a belief among older tribes that sometimes an entire place could wake inside another sky. Elders from neighboring regions spoke of hearing faint music carried on the wind for nights after the disappearance, a deep, humming tone that made the ground tremble. One police officer later resigned, claiming he had heard the same tone vibrating through his chest as he stood in the center of the empty village. Even though none of his colleagues reported hearing it, weeks later, satellite images of the site revealed faint circular impressions across the farmland, each perfectly concentric and approximately 10 meters wide. The patterns had not been visible at ground level and appeared to glow faintly in infrared scans, retaining residual heat long after sunset. Independent geologists examined the soil and found microscopic glass-like fragments fused to the top layer, similar to the aftermath of a lightning strike, but spread evenly across the entire village. Despite these findings, no official explanation was ever issued. The report was quietly shelved, and the area was declared restricted. By 2017, vegetation had begun reclaiming the fields, and the road leading to Calivayal was removed from regional maps. Yet travelers passing through at night still report hearing distant music carried through the hills, slow, mournful tones that rise and fall like a human voice calling from far away. Some say the air grows warmer when the sound begins, and if you stand long enough to listen, the trees seem to sway, though there is no wind, as if the forest itself remembers the vanished breath of a village that was never meant to leave.